Well, hi, everybody. It's the Stratosphere Lounge, December 26, 2017. I'm your host, Bill Whittle. Good to see everybody. Good to be back. Down in Florida, Natasha and I had a event with TPUSA that went really, really well. Probably end up chatting about that a little bit. Yeah, here we are. So the last show of 2017. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. You see movies and stuff that just, I remember seeing that a couple years ago. No, it was 13 years ago, that kind of thing. What I thought we'd do before we get on to the questions is I want to leap into something that I left hanging last week, or 2 weeks ago, last show. And I kind of purposely left it hanging. But I think probably the night of the show or the next day, I had such a definitive answer to this question I had left open that it was just almost more than I could bear. So I will spend 10 minutes or so talking about William Shakespeare, because last week I was talking about the Oxfordian theory that the works that we know as Shakespeare were written by the 13th or 14th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. Here's what's interesting about all this: whether or not you're interested in the Shakespeare question or not, what is very, very, very interesting to me, and very pertinent, I think, to the at least line of work that I'm in anyway, is how easy it is to convince people of things and how easy it is to unconvince them if they're open to reason. So let's just kind of walk back through the case here. I'm not trying to make a case for anybody or against anybody here. I'm just telling you what went on in my head, because I think it's really interesting. It's just interesting to me to be on the inside of one of these things and to understand how maybe you can get out of it. So here's basically the deal. A while ago, I saw a documentary called Last Will and Testament. It was a documentary making the case for Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. And it was done by the same person who did Anonymous, which is a feature film, a very good one, I thought. Also, basically looking at de Vere as the author of the Shakespearean plays. And in the documentary, making the case for de Vere, there were a number of things that I thought were compelling evidence. Now, the burden of proof is on the Oxfordians, and so I was initially skeptical, but then they started asking questions, and they put it together in such a way that I began to really seriously question it. It seemed to make sense. So here's the process. I see this documentary, and it's the Earl of Oxford. Okay, what have you got? The first thing I saw was a collection of William Shakespeare's signatures. There were only 6 of them surviving. And the second I saw those signatures, I thought there's no way that this is the hand, that this name anyway is the person that wrote these works. Not because Shakespeare had to have a beautiful hand, but because for a guy who wrote, as many words as he did, was it 27 plays, 32 plays, I don't know, sonnets, all of it. You cannot write that much and not be able to write your name. And if you look at the 6 surviving Shakespeare signatures, they look like they're scratched out by an illiterate. That I thought was very compelling. I thought it was very compelling evidence. I didn't see a way around that. They point out the fact that Shakespeare's 3 daughters were illiterate, just known to be illiterate. When they had to sign documents, legal documents, they basically just made a mark. And I thought, the daughters of the man that wrote, these plays, their daughters are illiterate. They can't read or write anyway. That doesn't seem very likely. And the main argument was that so much of what Shakespeare wrote about was about kings and courtiers and all of this stuff. 1/3 of his plays were set in Italy, and de Vere had been to Italy, and Shakespeare had never apparently been beyond London from Stratford. And when you put all this together with Derek Jacobi narrating, you can make an extremely interesting and compelling case. And this is the part that interests me. Because unlike most people, and I don't want to take too much credit for this because I have to tell you, I did it, I dragged myself kicking and screaming from this theory to seeing what's the other side. What does the other side say? And the first thing I heard, just in glancing on, just on internet bites, was that a statement that's saying that no serious scholar of Shakespeare accepts this, and none of them could ever get hired at a university if they did believe this Oxfordian theory. Now that sounded both arrogant and at the same time very, very compelling. So I went on and did a fair amount of reading. I especially read a book called Shakespeare, in fact. And the groundbreaking news of this episode of the Stratosphere Lounge is that the works of William Shakespeare were written by a guy named William Shakespeare, and he lived in Stratford-upon-Avon, and he looks the way we think he looks, and so on. So how did I get to this place after what seemed to me to be a reasonable series of objections? And this is where it gets interesting. The signature question was very damning, I thought. I thought that the daughter question was very, very strong evidence. The fact that he'd been to Italy, De Vere, I thought was compelling. The fact that he knew all about the insides of the intrigues of the court, I thought that was also compelling. One of the major problems with the Oxfordian theory is that De Vere died, I want to say 1604, and Shakespeare in either 1616 or 1618 or 19, right around in there. So Shakespeare went on for many years after De Vere, but the Oxfordians say that basically Shakespeare was the front, Oxford had written the plays in advance, and basically just released them over time. So that was the Oxfordian position, and it was compelling. And then you realize how powerfully people like Michael Moore are, and how things like the moon landing conspiracy and how the 9/11 conspiracy, how all of these things are sold. They're sold by putting up a series of what appear to be rock-solid pieces of evidence, and then either intentionally I suspect more likely because they're such zealots for this cause, not including any of the potential explanations of this. Great example of this phenomenon is when the guys try to sell the 9/11 conspiracy theory, and they point out that the fire was burning at, forget the numbers, but jet fuel burns at 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, and you need to get to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit to melt steel, so it couldn't have melted the steel, so therefore it had to be an explosion because the fire doesn't get hot enough to melt the steel. And that argument is utterly destroyed by a video I saw by just a regular guy blacksmith. And he took an iron bar, or steel bar, I guess, and put it in a vise and tried to bend it, and he couldn't. It was a big steel piece of rebar. And then he heated it up, but he didn't heat it up to a melting point. He didn't even heat it up until it was red hot. He simply heated it to about 1,000 degrees or so, put it in the vise again, and bent it like a piece of spaghetti. So there you go. If your entire argument for 9/11 is that the fire didn't burn hot enough to melt the support structures of the building, this guy shows you with your own eyes that it didn't have to actually melt the steel. Simply getting the steel hot enough weakens the steel enough so that the buildings come down. And needless to say, with the 9/11 conspiracy stuff, you could break all of these apart. Same for the moon landing. What appear to be very serious evidentiary, objections are fairly easily explained away. So on to the Oxfordian argument. The signatures. Pointed out that a lot of people in that time, there are a lot of signatures from people we don't have any signatures of at all, but we do have 6 surviving signatures of William Shakespeare. And it was pointed out to me that either 2 or 3 of them were on his will, and I knew they were on his will. But what was not pointed out to me was he wrote them as while he was dying in bed. I thought, well, that is a little exculpatory, isn't it? But what about the other 3? Why do they look so bad? Somebody said, I don't remember the details of it, but basically when there was some kind of a legal document, there was something about a piece of leather, like there was a tab of leather or something, and so you only had a very narrow space to write in. And okay, All right, that explains it. That doesn't necessarily mean that the De Vere case is out the window, but it's a reason to set aside what I thought was strong evidence. So how about the idea that his daughters were illiterate? I mean, who can possibly believe that the man that wrote those plays would have 3 daughters who couldn't write? And I was thinking, this is very serious evidence. And then the guy whose name I've forgotten, and I'm sorry to say, but the book is called Shakespeare, in fact, said, yes, his 3 daughters were illiterate. All women were illiterate in Elizabethan England. And it's just, yeah, they were, weren't they? Yes, they were. They were, I think 2% of the female population, something like that, of Elizabethan England could write. And that would be people like queens and duchesses, a very high aristocracy. Most women didn't write. There were no schools for women, and they had no reason to write. And this all changed about 50 years after Shakespeare died. I want to say mid-1600s is when they first started to really make the case for women being educated and treating like actual human beings. But that blew that argument right out of the water. And then down we go. But the thing that was most interesting to me was this. They talked a little bit about the education that he would have gotten in this public school, and that history was something that everybody just talked about, the way we talk about celebrities and so on. All of this worked for me. But the thing that actually put me firmly back in the Shakespeare category after my 2-week excursion into Oxfordian camp was simply this. They said the way the plays are structured implies a person with an extraordinarily deep working knowledge of how theater works. In other words, there are only so many actors in a play, and with costume changes and so on, you have to try to keep that number to the bare bones minimum, at least of speaking parts, acting parts. And the plays are structured in such a way that there's time for people to get in and out of costume, for the same actor to go ahead and do this, maybe do a second role or so on. They say that in some of the plays, some of the actors were named by name, that Shakespeare just wrote, Dave says, and he crosses it out, and he meant to say Hamlet, but he knows the guy who's playing Hamlet. And the more of this I read, the more I began to see how I had been misled. Again, I'm just telling you my experience because I think it's interesting. So the Oxfordians are saying that only a man of that level of education could write about things like Italy and life at court and so on. But if somebody would please look it up for me, I'm just embarrassed that I'm not able to mention his name. Can somebody just in the comment section find me the name of the author of a book called Shakespeare, in fact? But basically what he pointed out was, and this is something, again, that I hadn't seen, and this is why this is so compelling to me. You say, well, he didn't have a whole lot of experience in court. How could he possibly know what goes on at court? And then you realize he's not really at court. There are famous people. There's kings and earls and dukes, but they're famous people in that age. And a better question is, how could the Earl of Oxford ever have been able to write down to the level of some of Shakespeare's characters? How could he write down to the earthiness of it? The great genius of Shakespeare is his ability, I think, to get into so many people's heads, and to make a gravedigger as believable as a king. It's just remarkable. And when you take it in balance like that, and you throw in all the problems with everything else, and so on and so on and so on, you find that so much of this was due to his environment. And this is the point that was really being made in this book. And I think this is a really critical point. And basically what the author said was, when Shakespeare was writing, Irvin Lee Mattis, is that the author's name? Thanks, Dave. When Shakespeare was writing, Lee Mattis, there you go. Thank you very much. Irvin Lee Mattis. Amazing how fast this comes in. When Shakespeare was writing, he was writing during an English Renaissance. And he wasn't the only guy writing. And in point of fact, he wasn't the most famous guy writing at the time. Francis Bacon had done some writing, and what's his name? Christopher Marlowe. But Ben Jonson was the big up and comer then, and so Shakespeare is mentioned with a bunch of these people, and when they start breaking down, people who do nothing but study Shakespeare, his vocabulary, his style, his rhythms, and so on, say that many of the later plays of Shakespeare were co-written with other authors, and that the other authors' marks are as clear in those later plays as Shakespeare's are. And so basically what he was a part of an extraordinary time. Almost in a way, it's almost in a way a sort of a literary sort of an analog to the Founding Fathers, where you found a bunch of extremely bright people in each other's company, and the company of each other not only brought out the best of each individual, but propelled them to heights that they never ever would have reached without that company. So Jefferson was a brilliant guy, and Adams was a brilliant guy, and Franklin was a brilliant guy, and all the rest. Washington was not such a big intellect so much as just extremely brave and moral, and had that gravitas and so on. And there's that kind of milieu, this kind of mix. But the most important point that this author makes is that Shakespeare didn't become a god until the Victorian times. It wasn't really until Victorian era where Shakespeare began to be worshipped, when Shakespeare became Shakespeare, where he wasn't just a good playwright, or maybe even just the best English playwright, or maybe even the best writer ever. Somewhere in the 1800s, Shakespeare became the immortal bard, and he called it idolatry, bardolatry, something like that. He wasn't worshipped. And this is important because when you put Shakespeare into context, you see that while his work is an entirely different level than his contemporaries, there are many cases where the best writing of his contemporaries is better writing than the worst writing of Shakespeare. No one hit his highs. No one hit his average. But there were other writers that were writing some really excellent stuff, and I just started to read. After going through this, I figured I owed the guy from Stratford that I was going to read every play he wrote, and that's easier than it sounds. You just have to be ready, I guess. I mean, I was never ready to read it, but you just have to be ready. So I read Henry VI, and then I realized, oh, wait, I forgot, that's Henry VI Part 2. And then I realized, oh, my God, there's Henry VI Part 3. And I read Richard III, and now I'm on Lear. I'd already read Macbeth. And obviously I knew the major plays and some basic familiarity with them. You can't be a theater major without seeing Twelfth Night or As You Like It or something like that, being Midsummer Night's Dream being put on stage with your friends. So I just started reading it, and one of his earliest plays, one of his least known plays, is King John. And I couldn't get through King John because King John is written by Shakespeare, but it's not very Shakespearean. You read King John and you hear the language and you hear the manner of speaking, but there's no music there at all, none. And I finally said, I really did want to read all of the plays, but let's be realistic here. I'm not going to get through King John, and I don't want to stop, so I picked up Lear. And you pick up Lear, and half a page in, you realize, oh, this is Shakespeare. He developed. He basically got to be a better writer as all of these collaborations happened and so on. So just two things to wrap up on this with. From a political point of view, from a kind of a messaging point of view, you can sell almost anything to people if you look for evidence that is unusual, or at least, and this is important, at least seems unusual to the audience, not commonly known to the audience. and you say, how do you get around this? And you don't provide any explanation, and you put 2 or 3 of those in a row, and you will convince people that there's something fishy with the official story. But the real driver of all of this, is emotional. And I've come to realize that in my case, and I think in the case of most people, what drives these conspiracy theories is, to some degree, maybe a large degree, the idea that you've got secret knowledge and you're looking behind the veil. That's very attractive. But ultimately, what the case was for me and my leaping into this whole Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford thing, was that most people, I think, have a sense of justice. And it strikes people as a terrible injustice if the works of Shakespeare were actually written by somebody else. It offended my sensibilities that this could be the case. And I wanted to believe it. That's where it comes down to. I wanted to believe that it was Edward de Vere because it was interesting, it was different, it was romantic, and it had a sense of doing justice that was long overdue. Which is why the evidence that they proposed, which was good evidence, in some cases anyway, was convincing to me because I wanted to believe it. And as I said earlier, the hard part was saying, I want to believe it, I do believe it. I told Natasha, we were watching this anonymous thing on the couch, I said, I'm not going to refer to the works of Shakespeare anymore, I'm going to refer to the works of Edward de Vere, because this man deserves his recognition. So that's the emotional propeller. You want to believe something that provides you with a higher sense of justice. And nobody put this better than Case Closed, whose author's name I forgot last week, and then I remembered clearly, and now it's gone again. It'll come back to me in a second. I can see his face very, very clearly. But Case Closed was the same kind of deconstruction of the Kennedy assassination conspiracies that Shakespeare, in fact, is for the authorship question. It's not just a rebuttal; it's a deconstruction. It's a demolition of the argument. And what the author says in Case Closed is, why are so many people drawn to this idea that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, that there were multiple shooters, that it was maybe the CIA, or maybe it was Johnson, or maybe it was Castro. What is it that's so appealing to this idea that keeps people believing something, even in the face of a book like Case Closed, which simply closes the case? There's no question about it in my mind. So what is it? And at the very close of this book, thank you, Mr. Pershing, or Ms. Pershing, J.C. Pershing, Gerald Posner, thank you. At the end of this book, Gerald Posner, I think he really hit on it. And this applies to all conspiracy theories. Posner says that Kennedy was so large and Oswald was so small. Kennedy was such an enormously magnetic figure and a leader of the free world, young, handsome, good-looking guy, certainly had his flaws and all that, but he was largely loved, and especially after he was murdered. And so you've got this gigantic figure of Kennedy on one side of the scale, and he said on the other side of the scale, you have this insignificant, tiny, small, petty little man who committed this act. And he said, you want to put something heavier on Oswald's side of the scale so that it balances. You want to believe that Kennedy was assassinated by large forces because it would bring some meaning to it. And it goes right to that human need for meaning, and it's an overwhelming need. And also, it also goes to that human need for story. You know, everything we learn is through stories. That's why this is the battlefield. That's why the left isn't coming with rifles. They're coming with stories. They understand it. Everything we learn is from stories. All of Aesop's tables are stories. Shakespeare's are stories. We learn about the human condition from his stories. The Bible are a series of stories. It's all story. And Oswald is not a very good story. Although Posner makes him a good story. You start getting into the details of Oswald. It's actually very interesting. But People wanted more. They wanted a punchier ending, as we would say in Hollywood. And so something draws them. Same thing with 9/11. Most of the people who believe, not all of them, but most of the people who believe in the 9/11 conspiracy are left-wingers. And they want it to be George Bush's fault. They want it to be his fault. There are people who hate America. Certainly in the Middle East, it's almost universally considered that the whole thing was a CIA plot or plot by the Jews, and all the Jews didn't come to work that day and all the rest of this nonsense. Because they want that to be true. Especially in the case of many of these Middle Eastern countries, when somebody says, no, it wasn't us, it was the Jews, it gets rid of their guilt and it fires up their anger. And enormous emotional tide going in that direction to believe it. There are people who just simply do not believe that the moon landing happened. I don't know why. I think on some level, it's simply too much for them. I think it's just too big for them, that they simply can't get their minds around the fact that we actually did it. By the way, certainly everybody's had this experience, but I don't know how many times people have actually thought about it. Next time you go outside, and you're outside for any length of time, next time you see a jet in the sky at high altitude, like contrails, look at the front of the contrails and look at the jet. I'm not going to get into chemtrails because that's easily defeated too, and I've done it probably 3 times on this show. But just look at the jet, and just look at how tiny that little metal cylinder is, and think about how vast the air is. That probably 300 people on this little silver speck, way, way, way up there. And this is not a particularly pleasant thought, but imagine if that thing were to disintegrate, how far people would have to fall, and how huge the sky is, and how tiny, 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 tiny that little thing is. When you stand on the ground and look at a jet at 35,000 feet, and you think that there are 300 people in that thing, it seems not only miraculous technologically, it seems like the bravest thing that anyone has ever done, ever. But when you're on the jet, you're in a very small world. You got little windows, and it just feels like a cramped room. You just have to sit there. It's kind of like being in a movie theater for 5 hours or 12 or 3 or whatever the case may be. You have no idea how big the sky is and how small you are. And if you think that's impressive, think about the fact that the 3 men went to the moon and back, which is, by the way, this is another small little pet peeve. Most people, if you gave them a ball the size of the Earth and one the size of the moon, the relative sizes were correct, and you ask people what the distance between the Earth and the moon is, I bet you most people would come up with a number that's probably 1/10 to 1/4 of the actual distance. I bet the long ones would be about 1/4 of the actual distance. The moon is much bigger than we think it is, and it is much further away than it appears to be or feels like it is. And I think some people simply can't accept that. There are some people who have a grudge against government, and I'm one of those people. But I also have a sense of reason, and I have a strong dedication to getting things right and trying to find the truth, which is why I read Shakespeare, in fact, and why I'm proud of myself for having read that book. Because, again, and this is the end of it, I so much wanted to believe the Oxfordian theory. My sense of justice, which is really the reason I'm doing this work at all, had me just by the throat. And I remember thinking, God, I don't want to, it's probably not going to be very good. I'm just trying to talk myself out of it, but I didn't. I read it, and so the argument for William Shakespeare is overwhelming. So I wanted to clear that up because that whole Oxfordian thing was hanging. But I think it's also an extremely interesting point in terms of how the human mind works, and how I think if you're going to undo a story, you gotta undo it with a better story. That's actually just kind of flew into my head, but that's actually kind of what I think. In other words, if you think that I'm just talking about the emotional driver. Some people can simply be completely rational about this, but most people aren't. So, If you think about it, you get somebody gives you this incredible story of an unknown man who was banished from the court, and he was a genius, and everybody knew he was a genius, but he couldn't publish his plays, and he used a front man, and for 400 years, somebody else has been taking credit for his work, and that's a hell of a story, and you want to believe it. You want to listen to it. You want to believe it. And then other people will say, no, that's not true. It's nonsense. No, of course it was William of Stratford. Of course it was. And that's not satisfying. It's not satisfying. And you can say, well, all the evidence indicates that it was William Shakespeare. And that's not satisfying. What undid me anyway, was when somebody told me the story of William Shakespeare. And the story of William Shakespeare to me was, when I was finished, a much better story than the story of Edward de Vere, who parenthetically in this book was not a very nice fellow, according to the writer of Shakespeare, in fact, and they left that part out of the other documentaries. So there it is. If you want to get people off of the moon landing conspiracy, they believe in the moon landing conspiracy because they don't know the engineering. And they think that the technology wasn't good enough. They think that the risk wasn't good enough. They'll say things like, there is incontrovertible evidence that we didn't go. And for me, it's like the Shakespeare signatures or the daughters. It's like, yeah, what do you say about this? How do you explain that they got through the Earth's Van Allen radiation belts? Explain that they got through the radiation belts for being in there in a few hours in a relatively protected capsule. I mean, that capsule had to deal with that. If it turned out there had been a solar flare at the time of them either being on the moon or in transit, that might have killed the astronauts. But we figured it was worth the risk. Flares directed straight at Earth are really quite infrequent. But the Van Allen belts, while they are a state of higher radiation, are not fatal to people who go through them relatively quickly in a relatively well-shielded vehicle. So it's not this death zone that no one can cross. It's just not true. And so when you want to get somebody off the 9/11 off the moon landing conspiracy, you've got to tell them the story of the moon landing. You got to make it a better story than what they've been told about, people out in a studio someplace, and and lights that you can see, and there's 10,000 pictures taken from the moon, and on one of them there's a rock that has a roundish kind of a crescent shape, which is vaguely in the form of a letter C, and the entire moon landing conspiracy is built upon the fact that this is a prop labeled C rock, and that somebody accidentally tipped the rock over, and that's why the mask of the veil fell, and it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. The death knell of the Apollo moon landing hoax is that it's easier to go to the moon than it is to build a studio that size in a vacuum. And it has to be in a vacuum, because without a vacuum, you don't get the dust doing what it's doing. That's the end of it. The death blow to the Loch Ness Monster is it's an air-breathing plesiosaur. It has to come up for air 5-10 times an hour. We'd see it every hour. It's not there. Over. Done. The 9/11 conspiracy thing is not so much how easy it is to disprove, so much as just to say, how many people would have to be involved in this? I was at my dad's funeral in Arlington, and my first essay ever that I ever wrote about this was about the fact that in October, I think, of 2002, I went to my dad's funeral in Arlington. I saw the Pentagon down there. I asked the guy who was performing the service, Major Crisp, if he was anywhere in the area during the 9/11 attacks on the Pentagon. I said, yeah, I was on that hill over there. He saw the jet fly over and hit that building. He saw it with his own eyes. So was Major Crisp in on this thing? And was everybody who was in Arlington National Cemetery in on this thing? And was every single commuter who was en route and saw the jet, were they in on it too? And what about my friend Dana, who worked in New York City? Dana and her husband Michael are people I haven't seen in a long time, but they're very dear to me. And she was in New York City, and she heard this sound outside the window, and the entire room ran to the window, and they saw the second plane going down, down the street. Is everybody in on this conspiracy? Everybody? Does this not outweigh the fact that in one frame of one image on a digital camera, there's a white speck on the bottom of the plane that they claim is some kind of weapons pod or something. It's not on the next frame. It's not on the previous frame, or else they'd show it to us. One frame, the digital camera has produced a white blob on the bottom of an airplane. Therefore, millions of people were in on this conspiracy, and 15 years later, no one said boo, and no one's been murdered in the kind of numbers that they need to be murdered. It's just absurd. It's just absurd. So you have to basically tell the better story. And that's what we just consistently fail to do. We just don't do it. But the author of Shakespeare, in fact, did a very compelling job and made me really wish I'd gotten to know him. I've always had that feeling about Mark Twain, but now with Shakespeare, I feel like it would have been a fun guy to hang with. And it would have been something to be in a company of writers like Shakespeare and Francis Bacon and Ben Jonson and Chris Marlowe and a few others. And Bindlestiff just asked, wonder what I think about Holocaust conspiracies. Somebody please, I don't remember. Bindlestiff, this will be worth your time. If somebody could please post in the comments section whatever Stratosphere Lounge it was where the guy came in and said that the gas chambers never happened, and yours truly went absolutely nuclear. You see what I did there? Absolutely nuclear, and used the F-bomb, I think maybe the only time in the history of the Stratosphere Lounge after 173 episodes. If somebody could just tell me what episode that is, or if Bindlestiff is watching the comments stream, you'll get to know what I think about Holocaust deniers. So much for that. Anyway, it was a very interesting day. And interesting experience and a real lesson for me, and I learned a lot, and I am going to finish reading. If I don't read all of Shakespeare's plays, I am certainly going to read most of them, because they're just great reading. Lear, I couldn't put down. Richard III, couldn't put it down. And I went through and started highlighting pieces of verse, not the big famous quotes, although those as well, but things that just tickled me. They just said I thought was just interesting. Since this show is all about honesty, brutal honesty, and talking about things that maybe we don't want to talk about so much, let me find my iPad and I will expand the story just a little bit more. So, this was 2017 was a year of some hard lessons for me. I went to the TPUSA conference, and we got there for for Friday night. I'm sorry, the first night, which was Monday night, and it was Donald Trump Jr. and then Dennis Prager and then Dinesh D'Souza and then Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro got the kind of cheers that you'd think it was Taylor Swift or something. And I remember thinking, I really want to be up there because I know I can do, I know I can really light this room up. And it was the best audience I've ever heard. I've never, ever been in a room that was that hot. But I didn't get to do it, and I wasn't a main stage speaker the next day. I was in a breakout room, and I realized that a lot of this was due to my excessive pride in things. And when we all know that there's good pride and bad pride, and I certainly have good pride in the work that I do. I have enormous pride in my wife and the person she is. I have pride in a lot of things. I'm proud of my country. I'm proud of being a pilot. I'm proud of all these things. These are all things that are good pride. But bad pride, destructive pride, is something that usually comes from an absence of pride. Yeah, that's probably pretty much what I wanted to say. Overweening pride, standing on your, gathering your laurels about you, and then you're thundering, your righteousness, that kind of pride, usually comes from a background of not having any respect or pride of any kind. And so when you finally do develop some, it almost gets a little bit overdeveloped. It's like you get kind of defensive about it. And, the negotiations with the NRA fell through. A lot of that was pride on my part. A lot of it was the fact that I didn't think they were, well, all of it was the fact I didn't think they were treating me fairly, and I didn't think they were dealing with me, and I don't want to say they weren't dealing with me dishonestly, but they were dealing with me in a very adversarial, cutthroat kind of way, and I thought I deserved better than that. So rather than cave in, I just said, no, okay, walk away. And that was a shame because I liked working for them, and we needed the money. So that was pride, and other occasions of things where I've just simply decided not to do it because I just didn't think it looked good. I have to say in my defense that I have always been and continue to be the last guy out of the room at any event I go to. People have been late picking me up, and sometimes there's no one picked me up, and I as often stayed in a Motel 6 as I have in a Radisson or a DoubleTree or something. And I have no problem with this at all. I have no pretensions about this at all. I love my work. I love meeting people on the public speaking trips especially. But I am very protective about my pride in work. You know, it's like I don't like the sense that people are taking advantage of me. So so it's been a hard year on a number of fronts, and this has been beaten into me, as all of the whatever limited wisdom I have has been beaten into me. This issue of pride was one that I had to deal with a lot this year. And coming out of the TPUSA conference, I was a different person than I was when I went into it, and I was a much better person, if I do say so myself. So, excuse the glasses. So imagine my surprise when I'm reading King Lear, and I find I'm gonna have to. I did highlight it. Just give me 1 second. Yeah, lots of highlighting, and I just found this passage in King Lear. This is Lear's daughter talking to the Duke of Cornwall and the Earl of Gloucester. And in King Lear, Lear is a father who's basically going nuts. He is losing his mind, and he asks his 3 daughters, he says he's going to divide his kingdom equally among his 3 daughters, and he asked them to say, tell me how you love me. And the first 2 daughters are very effusive, and the third daughter says, well, I love you as my father, and I'm very grateful for all the things you did. But if I get married, then you will have half my love, and my husband will have the other half. And Lear just thunders and disowns her. Then he disowns another one. Then he disowns another one. And Lear has just gone mad with pride. That's the whole story of this. He's mad with pride. And he's destroying his family and his kingdom and everything else because of this overweening pride that he has. And I suspect that pride is a result of him, of Lear realizing that he's old now and weak and decrepit and bitter, and he had a surplus of hardship that's making him stand on his pride, which is something I can certainly relate to. And again, William or Bill Shakespeare, I don't know how you did it, but you managed to do it. It's just an offhand line, and I saw it, and it just stuck with me. And Reagan is talking about King Lear, talking about her father, and she says, "Oh, sir, to willful men, the injuries that they themselves procure must be their schoolmasters." And yeah, willful men, that's me. Proud people who are proud in the wrong way, people who are standing on their pride, willful people who don't want to compromise when they feel like they're right. To willful men, be like me, the injuries that they themselves procure means to purchase something, to buy something, to gain something. So the injuries that they buy, the injuries that they bring upon themselves, must be their schoolmasters. Which basically means that the only way that willful, proud people like myself ever learn a lesson is when these acts hurt us so much that they become lessons. And here it is. To willful men, the injuries, like losing a contract, or TV show or something like that. The injuries that they themselves procure, the harm that is done to them by themselves, must be their schoolmasters. It's going to be the lesson, and it's the only lesson. No guarantee it's going to work, but if that doesn't work, nothing will. Proud people have to have their pride beaten out of them by the damage that their pride is doing, and that's essentially the story of King Lear, and this is the story of 2017 for me. I don't believe Lear turns out very happily. I know my story is going to turn out happily, mostly because my wife is so unbelievably patient with me, and this certainly is better than I deserve. But in any event, it was an interesting couple weeks with me and my buddy Bill Shakespeare, and I expect we're going to be hanging out together in the future. All right, on to the questions. We've managed to burn about an hour, almost an hour on that. Let's have a look at what we have here today.